Welcome to the latest episode of the AAOS Now podcast, brought to you by the American Academy of Orthopaedic Surgeons. This monthly podcast series focuses on hotly debated issues and controversial trends in orthopedic surgery. Each episode presents nuanced perspectives to inspire further discourse, inform your decision-making, and maybe even change your mind.
Welcome to the AAOS Now podcast. I'm Dr. Stuart Fischer of the AAOS Now editorial board. Today we'll be talking about registries and how registries benefit orthopedic surgery. Our guests are Dr. Stephen Glassman of the Norton Leatherman Spine Institute at the University of Louisville. He's professor of orthopedic surgery at the University of Louisville. He is co-chair of the Registry Oversight Committee for AAOS and a past executive director of the American Spine Registry. Also, Dr. Huddleston of Stanford University, who is the chair of the American Joint Replacement Registry. Dr. Huddleston is professor of orthopedic surgery at Stanford University. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So the question I'd like to ask you both, and maybe Steve you could lead off, is how did the Registries Program come about, and what are the main goals and objectives of the program?
I think at the beginning, orthopedic surgeons, as many people do, recognize the importance of data. And I think for the groups that started the registry and AAOS, the idea that data is going to be important to our future, to protecting the procedures that we think are important for our patients, for identifying where things work and where things don't work, which with data collected and run by orthopedic surgeons that the community could trust, that registries are a way to build that data across a wide spectrum of how procedures are done in clinical practice.
So what would you say the main objectives are as you complete the registries or you build out information?
I think that more and more we want our decisions about procedures to be data-driven. I think that has melded over time from just looking at complications, maybe longevity of a procedure, to now looking at patient-based outcomes. And I think that it's critical for the people who understand the procedures, understand the selection, understand the data, to be ones who are running that process. So for that to be a part of orthopedics, I think is important to our present and our future.
Yeah, so speaking of data, Hutch, how do you get the data? Are the main sources hospitals, ASCs, CMS? Are there other sources such as industry, or maybe individual surgeons or large group practices?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to be here with you today, and that's a great question. So the American Joint Replacement Registry and the Academy have a business associates agreement with each submitting institution. The vast majority of those institutions are hospitals. As I'm sure you're aware, there's a migration of primary hip and knee replacements to the ambulatory surgery centers out of the inpatient setting and out of the hospital outpatient department setting. And so we've been focused on trying to capture this volume. As you can imagine, many ambulatory surgery centers don't have electronic health record. And so there are different challenges with recruiting ASCs to AJR that large and even small hospitals don't face. So most of our data comes in directly through the hospital. And for the last few years, we've had roughly 18,000 patients or so each year come in from ASCs. So that's a small number of the over 5 million procedures that we have total in the registry now, but we're certainly looking to expand it. And then in terms of our follow-up data, we do have access to Medicare claims data through the ResDAC process. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of delay when we get the data. But because of this process, we have 100% follow-up on all Medicare patients. Now, this isn't the entire cohort, obviously, and is one of the things that we're trying to improve to work on enhanced data completeness. But the follow-up data comes directly from Medicare claims data. And we also have some data on deaths that come in through a variety of sources, like there's a private vendor and then the National Death Index.
Yeah, with some of the ASCs, they're now parts of larger corporate entities. Will that be helpful?
Yeah, we think there's an economy of scale for sure, and we enhance our offers to larger healthcare systems to give them discounts to participate. Obviously, that's a win for all the stakeholders, so no doubt that will help.
Well, I think you can't underestimate how important it is what Hutch just said. The tie to CMS and the CMS data takes away one of the big faults of large studies that have been done in the past, where you don't know what's lost to follow up. And that's going to apply to Medicare patients going to ASCs too. Their Medicare data, if they have problems, complications, appear somewhere else, it still reaches the registry. So the power of that really differentiates the AAOS registry portfolio from essentially all other data sources that have been utilized previously.
And Stuart, just to build on that, so one of the most exciting things that has happened to the registry platform is that we now have an agreement to be part of the EPIC Community Registries Program. So EPIC is estimated to have roughly 50% of the lives in the United States, and they have contracted with us so that we can get information directly from EPIC. So in a perfect world, there will be no delay of the data coming in. And as long as your hospital is on an EPIC or your ASC is on an EPIC, which is much less common, obviously, then we're going to get the data in real time. So that's going to greatly improve our data completeness as well as our data coverage. And we're very excited about this. This has just been in the works for about 6 to 8 months, and we're putting the finishing touches on the initial pilot phase, but things are going well.
Well, it sounds good. So the registry reports provide all kinds of information, procedures, implants, techniques, complications, length of stay, comorbidities, and we'll eventually be looking at patient-reported outcomes. Is there anything else that we should include in there?
Well, I think that at some point it would be good to include costs, right? We have Medicare data that we can access. I think it would be good to include insurance-based data from private insurance companies. We've had a harder time negotiating those arrangements because of the insistence of AAOS and the registries that the data belongs to the registries and the physicians, and that other entities don't have access to that data. But I think in the future, being able to expand what we do with Medicare to private insurers would be something that would enhance the capabilities and the value of the registry.
The other category I'd add, Steve, would be imaging studies. So that's an aspirational goal for sure. Not many registries, certainly no large ones, have regularly been able to get imaging studies, but that would be a really great addition to the registry data set as well.
So looking at the numbers, AJRR reports on cumulatively 4.4 million procedures, 1.8 million hips, 2.6 million knees. But there are far fewer procedures recorded in other registries. 400,000 in spine, 53,000 in shoulder and elbow, and only a little over 1,000 in the musculoskeletal tumor registry. Obviously, there are far fewer tumor cases given the nature of the problem. But if you look at shoulders, there are close to 500,000 rotator cuffs done in the country in a year. And yet the SCR only covers a small number. Why is that, and is anything going to happen to change that, do you think?
I think there's several reasons, and I don't know that it's exactly the same for each of the other registries. I think, firstly, the longevity of AJRR is much greater than the other registries, right? They have a not quite 10-year head start, and that's a significant piece of it. The other issue is data collection is simpler, right? For hip replacement, there are a relatively limited number of diagnoses for which the procedure is performed, and, a relatively small number of different procedures. If you look at spine, there is an unlimited number of diagnoses which are often not agreed upon, and an equal number of surgical options for each of those diagnoses. And that makes data collection much more difficult. I would point out that for now almost 500,000 patients, dwarfs any other collection of spine data anywhere. So while it's not the same as AJRR, it is really different than what's available elsewhere. And I think that the complexity is both a difficulty. It makes it hard to work with the data, but a benefit because, you need the data so much more because there's so much more to sort out. And I think it's a similar picture in shoulder. Also, shoulder's even younger than the other registries in terms of getting going. Tumor is really behaves differently than the others. The amount of data that you need on each individual case makes it function more like a study group type thing where you need tremendous input on every case from the physicians. So that really is going to behave differently. But I think that it's both the head start and the work that was put in over years and years to get AJRR going and the relative uniformity of the type of data that you're looking for.
Stuart, the timeline point that Steve makes is really important to understand. So just to expand on what he talked about at the beginning. So the conversations about a national registry started between Dave Llewellyn, Dan Barry, Bill Maloney, and Richard Gelberman, who was the Academy president at the time, in the early 2000s. Okay, and it's now 2026. The first pilot sites in AJR started submitting data in 2010. And we got to 1 million procedures in the late 2010s. So it takes a long time. And when Dr. Maloney put together the registry modules, the expectation was this was going to be an 8 to 10 year runway before we saw much of a return on it. So it's important that folks don't lose sight of that.
So the timeline has been a lot longer.
Yep.
Yeah. So question to you both. How can the bigger institutions like hospitals, hospital systems, or even ASC aggregates make best use of registry data?
So our hope is that registry data is used as the source of truth for all quality endeavors. Now hospitals pay a variety of sources, Vizient and things like that, to get outcome metrics. Most of them have a hard time actually getting their own internal quality metrics. That's why they outsource it. So we have a pretty good handle on who's using the data for regular quality improvement opportunities. And let's just say we would hope that in the future it would be used by many more. But, for hip and knee replacement, we released about a year ago, 1-year revision rates that you can look at where you are compared to your peers. You can look at where you are at different institutions. And we have a variety of other quality metrics, complications, readmissions, length of stays, things like that are available. So the challenge is to get people to use it more frequently. And I think as we enhance the value of what our product is, it will be used more. But that's really how we envision it being used. And it should be applicable to all of our stakeholders, which are a diverse group.
So you can say that there are benefits to having registry data for an individual surgeon made available to that surgeon.
I think that hasn't been achieved yet, but it's a tremendous potential of the registries, right? A lot of effort and investment has gone into the dashboards to make them more user-friendly for surgeons, and to be able to, surgeons can at this point access their own dashboards. They don't do it very often. Look at their performance where someone else isn't feeding it to them or, using it to be critical to make decisions about what works best in their hands. There's a lot of scenarios where there are procedures that can give equivalent results, but what's best depends upon what you do best, right? And so for physicians to be able to look at their own dashboards and look at how they perform with a given procedure at that level of granularity is a tremendous potential tool for quality improvement on the individual physician level that is something they can seek out and look at independently rather than be presented to them from outside sources, insurers, things along those lines.
So some registry data is made available for research from the Academy through the Registry Analytics Institute. Are there any other ways that registry information can be made available for outside research or academic research?
Sure. So industry sponsors the registry. They are really responsible, especially at the beginning, with being able to get this effort off the ground. Without industry, we would have no registry. So we're moving towards a world where most of our revenue is coming from licensing fees, and everybody agrees that's healthy. But as part of your sponsorship for industry, you get a certain number of analytic hours from our analysts, and you can choose to do whatever you want with them. So we have very strict guidelines in terms of how that information can be disseminated by industry on their own. If it's for regulatory purposes and it's going to go to the regulator, then we don't need to take a look at it. But if it's going to be for marketing purposes, we need to see it, and you have to be able to show that you've disseminated the complete report, not just parts of it. And the guidelines we have are in line with the other major international registries. So that's the other major source by which information can get out, other than our annual report and our annual report supplement.
I think also from a research standpoint, I think in fact the registry data has been underutilized. And I think it's something that we all want to work on. It's a balance because the data, particularly the data tied to CMS, has been held in a regulatory way where it can't be disseminated even to sort of outside institutions, except under very limited conditions. But that looks like it's going to change. It looks like agreement with CMS is going to allow this to be disseminated to more university centers, which would allow a greater amount of data analysis to be carried out, which will hopefully facilitate AAOS members and registry members starting to do research on a more physician-led level, as well as the industry applications. I think that's something that we all see as a goal, and it sounds like it would be easy to do, but it turns out to be hard to guard the data, make sure it's being used fairly and honestly, and yet make it more widely available.
When you're speaking about the Academy, could you use registry data for projects such as clinical practice guidelines? And if so, would you be able to assign a specific level of evidence to registry data that's used for a CPG?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So I can give you an example on the AJR side. So one of the most important data points that's come out of AJR is, who's okay to get a cementless primary knee replacement. So at this point, based on AJR data and survivorship comparing cemented to cementless implants, for males, it's any age. And for women, it's definitely under 65. And for the over 65 cohort, where initially we thought that cementless knees were not functioning for as well as long, that's not really the case anymore. They're approaching equivalence. So that type of information really would be right for a CPG. And just to give you some idea on sort of where the research bottlenecks are, so this is definitely a function of the maturity of the registry. So the Registry Analytics Institute, we have 2 deadlines per year. We can support between 8 and 10 projects per year. So not everything that gets submitted is feasible. And then once we determine feasibility, then we determine, refining the question that needs to be answered and going from there. This past cycle, so keep in mind 8 to 10 is what we have the bandwidth at AJR to do now. This past cycle, we got 70 applications for different proposals, and the vast majority of them are feasible. So we're the rate limiting step at this point. That's a good problem to have. And the other thing I'd say is that it's really important for folks to understand that this is an observational data set, right? It's a similar cohort that we're following over time, and what we show are associations. We don't show causation. The purpose of the data is to show associations or no associations, and then from those observations, then you can go ahead and do randomized control trials and different study designs. But we don't attempt to show causation, and we have to remind people of that on a continuous basis so that the data are interpreted correctly.
And there's lots of different ways that the data could theoretically be used, right? So as an example, you could have a group of surgeons who do a similar procedure, who have a similar interest, right? Who could pull out their individual data from the registry so that identifies the patients with a procedure of interest, right? And all the baseline data that's been collected, right? They could then combine their data and enhance that data by in their own institutions going back and collecting the x-rays, collecting other follow-up points. And the registry is providing a tremendous service because if they had to do all the baseline work, the cost of that study would be 10 times as much. Whereas the registry can provide a place to do a nested study where they still have to enhance the data, because for each individual surgeon, his or her data belongs to them, right? So there's lots of different ways that the registry could serve as a support for research efforts beyond just studies that the registry itself would choose to do, or, guidelines or things along those lines. And I think one of the things that I would hope to see in the coming years is for a widening of the lens with which people look at innovative ways to use the registry to enhance the work that they want to do.
So to switch gears a little bit, looking kind of around the globe, some registries come from countries with centralized government health plans, while other countries, such as the United States, get all their information from a wider variety of sources. Do you find any difference in the data that might be reported from one type of registry versus another?
Yeah, no, so that's a wonderful question. And if you look at some of the landmark work that's come out of AJR in terms of how does the data set compare to international registries, the first observation was that the U.S. marketplace is not necessarily the same as, say, the Australian marketplace or the Japanese marketplace or the European marketplace. So not that's anything groundbreaking, but we actually could quantify that for the first time. So that was the first important piece of information. And then next is that are the data that's in AJR, are they nationally representative? So at least based on a nationwide inpatient sample, the answer to that is yes. So that was a relief. And then getting down to revision rates. So if you look at the National Joint Replacement Registry of England and Wales, their primary outcome is revision rate. So we did a study with one of their regulatory bodies called the Orthopaedic Device Evaluation Panel that was founded and run by a gentleman named Keith Tucker. And to get an implant into the market in the UK, you have to have an ODEP rating. And it looks at survivorship by duration and then also volume of procedures at the center. And so several years ago, we looked at comparing AJR data to the data coming to ODEP from the National Joint Replacement Registry of England and Wales. And we looked at 3 knees and 3 hips. And the survivorship at 5 years was nearly identical. The average difference was 0.18%. So that says that what's going into AJR is really sound and is consistent with other registries. So we're really happy about that. But that being said, we know the registry is leaky. So we have 100% follow-up on anybody who has Medicare. We don't have 100% follow-up on people who don't have Medicare. And that's a large portion of the population that we would like to capture. And so are the data sources different? Yes. Are the actual data different? Probably not a whole lot, at least as far as we can tell. But, you got to the core of the issue is that at this point in the AJR evolution, industry certainly expected that we would have federal funding for this type of effort. And that has not materialized and is certainly an aspirational goal.
And I think the variability between U.S. data and OUS data widens as you get away from hips and knees, right? When you look at hips and knees and people are looking at outcomes, there aren't many people who are thinking, yeah, this operation probably doesn't work, right? It's just a reliable operation. So you're talking about longevity. If you look, for example, in spine, there are procedures where there's questions of does this work or does this not work, and where the rates of revision or complication would be, as a baseline, much higher. And in those data sets, you really see different behaviors in different countries. So I think that at least in the work that we've gotten to participate in, it doesn't look like you could just substitute national registries elsewhere for data in the US and be able to apply it in a way that would be really useful. And, I think some of that's cultural, some of that's expectation, some of that's how people approach revision. There are places where you get one operation just culturally, and it doesn't matter how badly that went. No one would consider having a revision as an option. Very different than how the U.S. behaves and performs. So I think having our own data based on U.S. population is really important to decision making for us.
Yeah, so Hutch, this is for you. Along the international lines, how does AJRR interact with ISAR, the International Society of Arthroplasty Registries?
Yeah, so we are a member of the International Society of Arthroplasty Registries. I'm headed to the annual meeting in a few hours that's going to be in Lund, Sweden. But I would say in general, the other members of ISAR have been very welcoming and very straightforward about sharing best practices, learning opportunities, and the like. So it's a very collaborative, collegial group. And they have certainly taught us a lot. They understand the importance of AJR, just given its sheer volume and given that, we're the largest marketplace for hip and knees in the world. I would say ISAR has been of tremendous value to us, and hopefully we're providing some value to the foundational members of ISAR, but certainly to the registries that are younger and looking to expand, of which there are many across the globe at this point.
Yeah, so I want to ask you both, do you have any examples where you know that registry data has resulted in a broad change in clinical practice of one procedure or one way of doing things in the United States?
So I can give you a few examples. The usage of navigation and robotics is a hot topic in hip and knee replacement, and everybody wants to see if the juice is worth the squeeze. And I would say if you look at uptick of the use of robotics in hip replacement in AJR, it's 5 or 6%. If you look at combined navigation and robotics for knees in AJR, it's approximately 20%. And so in aggregate, if you look at all data sources, using robotics for hip and knee replacement hasn't been shown consistently to improve the outcomes. So why are we all still putting this effort into trying to improve it and refine what's currently on the market, and why is it having such tremendous growth? So people think it's just a matter of time before we show it's better, but what's come out of AJRR before this March is consistent with what's been generated so far, is that no big change in outcomes using a robot or not, both in hips and knees. In the annual supplement that we just released at the Academy in March, we showed that at least with one specific company's robotic unicompartmental knee arthroplasty, their survivorship was improved when you used it. You have to use a robot to put theirs in. So we know with 100% certainty that the robot was used in this case. So in those cases, the survivorship of that implant put in with the robot is better than anybody else, and that's compared to the aggregate group. So that's a pretty powerful data point. We haven't been able to show that with total knees yet, but we're the first to show that with unicompartmental knees, which is really not a surprise to anybody, given that it's not really debatable that robotics or navigation allows you to have more precision. Now, accuracy is really what the big question is, but there's not consensus on what would be defined as accurate because we don't know really what the target is, but we know we can hit what the selected target is. So that's one. The next one, I mentioned cementless knees previously. So surgeons love cementless knees. If we can get away from bone cement, that's great for a lot of reasons, but the gold standard is still bone cement usage for primary knee replacement. That's changing rapidly, and I think AJR data has really been giving people comfort to go ahead and at least try cementless knees, and once you get a hold of it and get good at it, I think there's no going back as long as you can appropriately select the patients. And then the last one would be the use of a triple tapered femoral stem in hip replacement. We showed about a year and a half ago that with AJR data, a triple tapered stem for cementless usage in primary hip replacement, whether it's osteoarthritis or fractures, is outperforming even cemented stems, which is a big change and really has contributed to the tremendous growth of the use of the triple tapered stem. So those are sort of 3 points that I would say have really changed practice that AJR has had a big hand in.
Yeah, so while registry data is, largely beneficial for both institutions and individual surgeons, are there going to be any negatives to having this kind of information widely available? And is there potential for it to be misused? I think a lot of our surgeons want to know that.
First of all, the data is widely available, right? It's available outside of what we are doing. And if people think that if we just don't collect any data, no one will know what the data looks like, they're just mistaken. The thing that surgeons had that no one else had for a long period of time was patient-reported outcomes, and now the government is circumventing that. by requiring patient-reported outcomes. I think that the thing that's most likely to be successful is for us to have and understand our data, to understand what works well and doesn't work well, because we'll be the best advocates for that. The other point that's really important is nobody else gets access to this data. Insurance companies, government, even the people we partner with just get de-identified data sets even when we partner with them. This is not a situation where someone gets to look at an individual surgeon's data other than that surgeon or potentially the administrator at his hospital that's submitting the data for them. I think that is a pretty common misconception that sort of this data could become available to people that you wouldn't want to have your data. I don't know, Hutch, I'm sure you hear that a lot as well.
Yeah, I think that's very well said, Steve. So there's no question that there's lots of people rating us, and there's no question that much of it is very inaccurate. And that really should be startling to surgeons. And I think most surgeons are just too busy. They say, oh, we can't control things that we can't control. And I certainly understand that. But somebody's going to be rating you. So who better to rate you than the surgeons themselves? So I think that's really important. And Steve hit on the other safeguards that we have with the data. But where I envision this going with American Joint Replacement Registry is no different than what every other international registry that's mature has done. And this is a great example of, ISAR bringing us along so that we have similar policies. So the National Joint Replacement Registry of England and Wales creates a revision rate, which they can do very accurately because of the nationalized health system there. And that revision rate goes to the surgeon, and it also goes to the hospital. And if you are an outlier, which would be defined as 2 standard deviations for the mean in our funnel plots, you get a letter, as does the hospital, that says, you're an outlier, give it some thought. We don't want anything from you. We're going to check in with you in a year when we give you your data next year. That usually is going to prompt a discussion between the hospital and the surgeon. And from what I'm told at NJR, just about everybody figures it out on their own. They either figure out why are they an outlier and do something differently, or they just say, look, I don't do that many hip or knee replacements, and I don't really know that I'm doing anything that I can change. I'm using implants that have good track records. I do what everybody else does, and I think I'm picking the patients well. This is not a big part of my practice. I'm just not going to do it. And that's probably a good thing for everybody, just like it is in much of life. Remarkably, what I've been told is there has not been any instance where the surgeon didn't get better and had any disciplinary action brought against them. So we're feeding revision rates back to the surgeons now. They're the only ones that have access to it. And at some point, I can envision us having a similar process. I think we're a ways off from that. We have higher priorities, but that's really where I think things should go, and I think we'll get there eventually.
So looking at the future, patient-reported outcomes are going to have a much, much bigger role in how we all practice. How are the registries going to incorporate the PROM data?
So it's a little bit different in hip and knee versus spine. In spine, it is and has been for a long time the currency, right? And it comes back to the fact that the assumption by patients, by payers, by surgeons is if you have a hip replacement, it's basically going to be a good operation, right? And most people see improvement. Whereas in spine, there's a lot of variability. So patient-reported outcomes have been the currency of measuring that for a significant period of time. And that's probably the registry that's further along from a percent-wise in terms of collecting that data. I think that will change with the government requirement in hips and knees for PROMS data. But in all honesty, I think there's a significant possibility that governmental effort will fail because the mandate is on the hospitals, right? The hospitals are required to report it, but the data collection is largely at the physician private practice level, right? And it's very hard to mandate the hospital collects something a year out when the patient isn't interacting with the hospital. So I think there's a really outstanding question of how scalable that will be and whether they will in fact be able to do it through the process they're utilizing. I think it would be much better to be collected by the registries, by physicians who have the ability to and experience with interpreting that. And I think it's important that the registries continue to incorporate that data. And I think that the government mandates will probably energize that a bit. But in the end, I think that it may fall back that the registries are where that data is most usefully applied. I think that the governmental programs are going to have a really hard time enforcing the mandates that they've set up.
Yeah, just to build on what Steve said in terms of PROs and AJRR. So we have roughly 1,200 contracted institutions in AJRR and 5,000 surgeons. We have 750 institutions out of the 1,200 that have submitted a PROM, either pre or post. So the government mandates have definitely increased submission of PROs, and there's a variety of ways which AJR can facilitate that. You can send us the data, we can package it for you, send it back to you, and so you can submit it to CMS. You can do it directly on the website. You can send us the data, and we can submit it for you as our designation as a qualified clinical data registry through the government. AJR is here to support people with PROMs, but there's no question this is a heavy lift, and I would say our experience so far has been that the thresholds that are being put forth, i.e. 50% linked PROMs for hip and knee replacement to avoid a penalty, and the substantial clinical benefits of 20 and 22 points, which have now been shown in AJRR and in FORCE TJRR to be much below what the satisfaction thresholds are, those are going to be refined. But, you know, as Steve said, this is our currency, and it's really your business intelligence. So I think PROMs are really significant value for what we do, but getting them used for the right purposes is still being worked out.
Mm-hmm. Steve, I want to ask you that the spine registry is a collaboration between AAOS and the American Association of Neurological Surgeons. Going forward, do you see any more joint efforts like this?
Well, I think this collaboration is unique in a lot of ways because spine lies about 50% in orthopedics and 50% in neurosurgery. And when we started with the idea that we're going to have a spine registry, everyone thought, well, it's aspirational that we could do this together with neurosurgery, but that will never happen. And it's in fact been tremendously successful. It's been tremendously cooperative. It's led to joint efforts on advocacy and other things. The setup of how spine is distributed across the country is very unique. So I don't know that it's an exact model for other collaborations, but it's 50% of the investment, 50% of any profits, 50% of the decision making. It is really a very collaborative effort that's been very good for spine. And I think the only way that we'd really have a successful spine registry.
So to wrap it up, and I really have to ask this question, do either of you see a role for AI going forward in the development of registries and promulgation of data and conclusions?
Oh, without a doubt. And I can give you a real world example. So, as I said, we have lots of room for improvement at AJRR for our data completeness. And so we have partnered and have just started a pilot with a company called IOMIC, which is using AI tools to extract data directly from the EHR without human intervention. They've been successful. They're in NISQIP at this point, so we're very excited about that. But that's the best example that I could give you in terms of what we're going to see with AI. But no doubt it's here to stay, and I see it as a tremendous tool, assuming it's used appropriately.
So we've been talking about registries. Thanks to you both for a very stimulating discussion. I'm Dr. Stuart Fischer from the AAOS Now editorial board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the AAOS Now podcast, part of the AAOS Bone Beat Orthopedic podcast channel. Production and editing provided by MK Quinn Media. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear future hot takes on the issues that affect orthopedic surgeons, visit aaos.org/AAOS Now podcast and follow us today.